guys. My name's Jana Roso, if you don't already know me. I'm very excited to be chatting with everyone today and talking more about gut health, which is something that I am so passionate about for personal reasons and also for reasons that pertain to all of the patients that I see. And we know that antibiotic use over the years has quadrupled, and there's so many kiddos who need antibiotics, but also those who are being prescribed too many antibiotics and not enough guidance on how to get their microbiome back to baseline or back to homeostasis. And so that is definitely a passion of mine, to educate and to help my patients get back on track after antibiotic use. And I do get a lot of questions. I get a lot of parents email me when their child's sick and when they are needing advice. And so I thought, well, this will be a fun way to just get more information out there for people who are curious. And I am one of the pediatric providers at Alive and Well, and I've been practicing functional medicine for about 10 years now, which is wild to think about. And before that, I was doing pediatric primary care for many years. And so I'm very well versed in all the childhood illnesses and the antibiotics used and when and why. And so today, let me share my screen, you guys. Let's see. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. I'm gonna try and hide this so that it's not in my way. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so today we're talking about recovering the gut after antibiotics. And we're gonna touch on a few things. We're gonna talk about how the gut influences other organs.
Oh yeah, I thank you for reminding me. Let me go look.
Hey guys, one more quick little reminder to put yourself on mute if you're not already. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to talk about the effects on other organs in the body. Of course, how antibiotics affect our microbiome, and then how we're going to support our microbiome, especially after the use of antibiotics, how we can get our gut back to normal. We know that it's so important. And so a wise man once said, all disease begins in the gut. And I truly believe that after practicing functional medicine for so long. I see a lot of patterns. I see a lot of parents that tell me that their child had repeated antibiotics when they were newborns. We're still having some feedback. That they were having lots of illness. They were sick all the time, given a lot of antibiotics. And then we're seeing digestive issues. We're seeing autoimmune disease, lots and lots of chronic illness. And so we want to dive in and learn, well, why is this happening? And what can we do about it? How can we really repair our microbiome, which really leads to so many other issues? And so I'm going to bring us back a little bit to 8th grade biology, and we are going to look at this diagram for a minute. And I think it's really neat to just think about how digestion and absorption and everything having to do with the microbiome doesn't just exist in this lower aspect. We're actually, digestion starts when we see our food, when we're salivating, when we're chewing, when we're calmly eating. And so, I think it's also really important to talk to our children about that. Hey, our gut, our microbiome, our stomach is going to be healthier if we are calm, if we are eating slowly and chewing and digesting well. And we know that the majority of our gut bugs, this bacteria, over 1 trillion bacteria that vary in species, they live primarily in the large and small intestine, but they are truly all over our body. And so we have to remember that when we're talking about the microbiome. So what does the gut influence? What happens here? We have more than half of all of our cells inside of our body are bacteria, and most of these reside inside of the intestines. And so they're going to be educating our immune system, since about 70 to 80% of our immune system lies within our gut. That's kind of wild to think about. And when I see children who are having chronic illness, recurrent infections, recurrent strep, I always go back to talk about, okay, well, what are they eating? What's going into the gut? And then let's look at what is going on inside of their gut, what needs to be rebalanced, because that is obviously affecting their immunity. Of course, we're digesting, absorbing, synthesizing vitamins and nutrients, protection against certain pathogens, producing neurotransmitter chemicals, which are then going to communicate via the vagus nerve with our brain. And so you, I'm sure, have heard of the gut-brain connection and how the vagus nerve is so important. And so we have to remember that when we're dealing with any kind of mood disorders, that there could be something going on in our gut. So of course, it's home to bacteria, archaea, micro-eukaryotes, viruses. So many different species live within our microbiome. So here's just a fun little graphic to see how this works. Of course, we're modulating the nervous system, short chain fatty acid production. So that is going to be through dietary fiber. And that helps prevent colon cancer, kind of helps move things along throughout the gut. We're going to store fat and other nutrients. This is where we talked about the immune system being so important there, and protection against other pathogens coming in if we have a healthy microbiome. A lot of the patients I see, they are lacking in their immunity in their gut, and they're lacking in things like stomach acid. So they actually are not protecting against pathogens very well. And we'll do these stool studies and we'll find things like parasites or overgrowth of other bacteria. And that's really leading them to a lot of struggles because they might not have the protection they need. So restoring and rebuilding the microbiome is more than just giving an over-the-counter probiotic. I really want you to leave here knowing that, because when I used to work in primary care, I remember thinking, okay, if I give an antibiotic, I tell people to go buy a probiotic. I don't know which one to, I might not know which one to tell them. Maybe I'll tell them cultural. I don't even know how long to tell them to take it. It was just, you give an antibiotic and you tell them to give a probiotic. And I hope things have evolved a little bit in that, perspective in primary care. But all that to say, I really want us to know there's more we can do than just that probiotic. So I mentioned this earlier, but it's estimated that over 100 trillion species live in the gut, and they're supposed to live in harmony. It's really the goal is to not wipe everything out. We are not living in a bubble. We are not a sterile environment. And for sure, our gut is not a sterile environment. So there's going to be opportunistic pathogens, but we want them to be balanced with the good microbes that we know have very, very important jobs. And there was this really neat project started back in 2010 called the Earth Microbiome Project. And this company is doing large-scale studies on the microbial diversity around the world. And so if you get on their website and check it out, they actually are not accepting any new samples. I think they're kind of maxed out, but I think their goal to assess different microbiome species in the world is very neat. Looking at, okay, what people are eating, how they're living, what this does to our microbial diversity can really help us understand the gut even more. Okay, so what do we know about what antibiotics do to the microbiome? I think most people know that generally we're wiping out bacteria. either good, bad. There's a little bit of a wipeout. Okay, so we are reducing microbial diversity. We can not only kill the pathogen of concern, which is truly why patients are put on antibiotics. You're trying to get rid of that strep. You're trying to get rid of that ear infection. But we're also, on the other side, we're eradicating the beneficial microbes. And so what happens when we are eradicating beneficial microbes is that we enable other more negative things to flourish, like Clostridia difficile bacteria. And this can be common for those on recurrent antibiotics, those hospitalized needing antibiotics. This is a really nasty bacteria that can lead to some really horrible side effects like terrible diarrhea. We can also increase the risk for colon cancer with repeated use of antibiotics because we're wiping out those short-chain fatty acids. In a study that I read, there was also an increased risk for asthma and allergies in infants exposed during pregnancy. So these delicate little microbiomes getting their first dose of antibiotics can be actually pretty detrimental to what that holds for their future with disease. And then, of course, we're increasing antibiotic-resistant genes. So I was chatting the other day with a friend whose child had had strep recently, and he told me that it was really unfortunate he needed multiple antibiotics to clear this strep because the dad thought it was because he had forgotten to change out the child's toothbrush on day 3, and he had actually changed the child's toothbrush out on day 7. So he was blaming himself for this child's recurrent strep. And I said, well, you know what? What was the antibiotic he was put on? And he said, well, the first one was amoxicillin. And I said, I bet you that it just was not responsive, because there is a lot of resistance to, and I'm using this as an example, but there's a lot of resistance to amoxicillin for strep specifically. And so as we learn more and more, we are seeing that these pathogens are becoming very smart, and they can outgrow and outlive different antibiotics that we might be using. And that can be really scary because there is a time and place for the use of these antibiotics. So we want to make sure that they work when we are using them. So I did a little digging, and I thought this was really wonderful to share these common antibiotics that our kiddos are put on and what they do, what we have learned through the research. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these. The first one was clindamycin. And what we found was that there was a loss of those short-chain fatty acids. And that can affect, like we were talking about, the growth of cancer cells within the colon, the ability for motility to be up and working well. There's an increased risk for C. diff overgrowth. And then long-term effects on Bacteroides species. So there's a few families that we see studied, and they're the bulk of what we're seeing in the gut: Bacteroides, Bifidobacterium, and Lactobacillus. So we'll talk, a lot about those, or you might see those listed on the back of probiotics, the back of foods. And so one of those is Bacteroides species, and this specific antibiotic was targeting that. The second one is augmentin, which is a combination of amoxicillin with something called clavulanic acid. And this is very strong. This is a much stronger antibiotic than amoxicillin alone. And so what they found was there was a total wipeout of gram-positive cocci, like strep. And in return, it also wiped out Bifidobacterium. Cephalosporins like ceftonir, you might have heard of ceftonir. This can increase opportunistic pathogens because it lowers diversity. So it's going to kill off a lot of beneficial flora and allow for the more negative opportunistic pathogens to overgrow. Levofloxacin, which I don't see used as much, Levaquin, but this I feel like was more popular maybe as we were children growing up, but this can increase E. coli strains. So you can just have an abundance of E. coli in the gut. And then azithromycin, which is also known as Zithromax, and Z-Pak, you might have heard of a Z-Pak. It's very commonly used for bronchitis, if you come in with a persistent cough, and very, very readily available, and providers like to prescribe this. But what they found was it increases a specific strain of actinobacteria, and then it decreases, once again, bifidobacterium. So we're seeing a loss of good flora, a gain in some more negative flora. Okay, and this is the study down here if anybody wants to explore that. So the main question is, can we restore homeostasis? Can we get the gut back to where we're balanced, where we're not worrying about this overgrowth of a negative species and the lack of a beneficial species? So I wanted to talk about two studies that I read. One was using a medication called ciprofloxacin, which is a pretty strong antibiotic. I don't use it in children. There are some detrimental side effects to the mitochondria with the use of ciprofloxacin. But what they discovered was that the effects were pretty quick. They noticed that there was a loss of microbial diversity within 3 to 4 days of the medication use. But after discontinuing the medication, by about a week later, these communities began to return to their initial state. So that's good. And it's not that these studies were using some big hefty probiotics. They truly wanted to see, okay, what happens after this antibiotic is discontinued. But they stated the return was incomplete. So they did not see a return of homeostasis and balance completely after discontinuation of the antibiotic. Okay. And the other study was using amoxicillin, one of our favorites. I remember growing up, my parents had a bottle of amoxicillin just in the fridge at all times. And if we ever developed a cough or a sore throat or earache, they just busted out that pink medicine. And I remember getting a lot of doses of that. And I'm sure if you grew up in the 80s like I did, you can relate to that pink medicine. But this was a mouse study mouse study with amoxicillin. And what they did, they had a control group that did not receive any antibiotics. And then they had 3 other groups receiving amoxicillin at different intervals. So one got it for 3 days, another got it for 7, and the third for 14. And they were using human doses on these mice. And then they were collecting their stool every 4 days. And so what they saw was a significant reduction in richness, which I'm going to refer to as diversity, from the 2 groups that took amoxicillin for 7 and 14 days. And then they expanded it and said, okay, well, the group C that took amoxicillin for 7 days, actually their richness remained lower until about day 13, while the group that took it for 14 days remained lower until day 21. And this is fascinating because we are not using antibiotics for 3 days. That is unheard of unless you're just discontinuing it on your own. But we very much are using them for 7, 14, sometimes 21 days for sinusitis, for pandas. I have a lot of patients with pandas, and in order to stabilize them, we're using these medications for quite some time. And so they did see regrowth, but it took quite a while, and it was dose dependent. So that is important to note, and especially for these kiddos, like I was just talking about my friend who told me their child required multiple antibiotics for their strep. So they finished one and then started another. So then you have those 2 antibiotics with a different uniqueness as to what they're doing to the microbiome. But then you also have the time frame after to really heal and restore. Okay. So I love this graphic because there's more than just antibiotics that affect our gut health. And so I wanted to touch on that. quickly, but of course we have diet. If we're stressed, how we're living, what we're eating, that can impact our microbiome. And then when you add antibiotics on top of that, you can, you have the dose can be different and unique. There can be drug resistance to the antibiotic. And depending on if it's a broad spectrum or narrow antibiotic, what it targets in the gut can really affect the recovery. If the route of drug administration, I think that was really great to put that on here. Of course, taking something orally is going right into our gut microbiome. So that will affect it directly as opposed to an antibiotic for pink eye, and you're putting drops in your eyes, or even an intranasal antibiotic. So the route is important. And then, of course, the length of treatment, as we just saw in those studies. And so you might start out with a very healthy microbiome, but if we are needing broad spectrum antibiotics, if we're needing them frequently, we're needing big doses or lengthy periods of time, we are going to end up with dysbiosis up here in red, and that means imbalances, okay? And this is another graphic I just needed to share with you guys. I love this. And it's not only about restoring the good bugs, but it's also about what we are doing to our gut permeability, to the lining of our gut when we use things like antibiotics. There can be a level of inflammation that is done to the intestinal barrier. And I think of this as like a cheesecloth. It's very thin, permeable, but also very delicate. And so if we have antibiotic after antibiotic, we also have to think about the inflammation. We have to think about what has been done to the intestinal barrier. And this barrier is very important. As you can see on the left side, it is keeping things out that should not be in the bloodstream, like food particles, like large undigested food and proteins and things that could really trigger our immune system. And much of the time we do see leaky gut, and we see increased risk for food sensitivities, increased risk for things like eczema and allergies. And so we want to also take care of the gut lining when we are restoring our microbiome after antibiotics. All right, so now we get to dive into the fun part of what are we going to use? What do we give? What do we use? My first favorite product to recommend after antibiotic use is a neuronutrients product called Balanced Gut Support. And this is a newer product that I'm really loving. It's a powder. It's very easy to mix. And it contains a special colostrum or immunoglobulin called immunolin. It is one of the best and greatest immunoglobulins on the market. And so it helps feed good feed good microbes. But most of all, it enhances that intestinal barrier that we were just talking about. It helps protect it and to seal it. And colostrum, if you remember that word, it is from mom's milk, the very first part of mom's milk. So newborns often get this rich colostrum full of proteins and fats and vitamins, and it really helps to seal and protect their gut. But often, obviously as adults and even older kids are not getting colostrum regularly. So this is something great to bring on board and even use this when a child is not on antibiotics, because it can help bind and eliminate harmful pathogens. And it also supports the mucosa throughout the intestines and helps lower inflammation. So I am a big fan of ongoing use of this balanced gut support, but definitely increasing the use after antibiotics. Okay, the second product is going to be one of our spore-based probiotics called Megasporbiotic. And this comes in either capsules or a gummy. I'm wondering how I can mute everybody on here. Sorry, guys. So a lot of feedback. Okay, maybe it fixed. So spore-based probiotics, they are very popular and very important because they have this exterior spore coating that can provide resistance to digestive tract acid and other chemicals in the digestive tract so that they can make their way down to where they need to be. And often these spore-based probiotics are made with various bacillus species, which are highly studied for their antioxidant effects. They have immunomodulatory properties, and they can help control pathogens. So I'm a big fan of this one specifically from Microbiome Labs. And like I said, it does also come in a gummy if your child is not able to swallow capsules or you have a very hard time mixing powder into a food or a drink. Another highly recommended product is going to be a very specific probiotic strain called Saccharomyces boulardii. And this one is from Claire Labs, but they have rebranded their supplements. So they're looking a little bit different now. But Saccharomyces boulardii has been recommended for so long. You might know the over-the-counter product called Floristore. I know that that can be recommended. It's actually a friendly yeast, and so it can crowd out negative yeast. And when we have antibiotic use, yeast is often a pathogen that loves to take over and to overgrow. It's very opportunistic. So this species can also help reduce diarrhea and stomach pain from antibiotic use. It actually boosts secretory IgA levels, and those are our immune system levels in our gut. And oftentimes with recurrent antibiotic use, we find on stool studies a low secretory IgA. So this is a great way to boost that. It also can help with constipation or poor motility after the use of antibiotics. So just another benefit of Saccharomyces boulardii. Another wonderful product is from Designs for Health. It's their GI Revive. And they do have this in a powder. And if your kids are not fond of peach, they also have it in capsules. And so this is a good blend of amino acids, herbs, minerals, glutamine. It's just so supportive, and it really is, the name says it all. It revives the GI tract. It supports the intestinal permeability. It lowers inflammation, and it really soothes the digestive tract with aloe. It just has so many properties to just create a soothing environment. So this is a wonderful powder to use as well. And you can mix these. You can mix these together if you are adding multiple things at one time. And we can't forget about the power of food and the power of, what we can utilize from our home. We don't always have to run out and buy a supplement. We can utilize things like bone broth, and we can make these, or we can buy them at the grocery store. This brand is my favorite, Kettle and Fire. It has a lot of protein. It has wonderful amounts of collagen, which help with inflammation. If you've ever made bone broth, you see that kind of thick gelatin layer at the top as it's cooling off, and that can really, really help with the intestinal permeability and what we would say seal the gut lining. And it's just really easily digested, so it can be really soothing. I mentioned glutamine earlier, so this provides food for the cells and provides energy that can help also heal the gut lining. The one thing I will mention about bone broth, and I get a lot of questions about this, but if your child has a big histamine issue, you might have to be careful about how much bone broth they get or how long you cook it for, because it can be high in histamine. And so some of my patients cannot tolerate bone broth, but if you can, it is so wonderful and so healing. And then I just wanted to throw out there some other probiotic foods. These can be easy to incorporate, things like yogurt and kefir and kombucha. kids often like those. They might not be such a great fan of kimchi or sauerkraut, but I do find that if you have little ones, babies and toddlers, and you can incorporate these, the earlier the better for their microbiome, and trade off what you're incorporating. Maybe one day we do a little sauerkraut juice in our food, and the next we give some fermented pickles, and then we do some kefir. So this is going to just create more diversity in the gut. And prebiotic foods are going to feed the probiotics. Okay, so these are just as equally important. And so most kiddos are eating bananas. The greener the banana, the more prebiotics it contains. Apples are an easy one, oatmeal. One of the ones that is not listed on here, but is one of my favorites, is jicama. And if you go to H-E-B or another grocery store, they often have this pre-cut, and it's a really great food to put in your child's lunch. It's a little crunchy. It's a good finger food for littles, and that provides a good amount of prebiotics. So once again, we're feeding the gut, we're restoring, we're creating homeostasis. So our goals with all of these products and foods are to increase beneficial flora that have been wiped out by those antibiotics, to really support the immune function so that we can stay healthy, and then to keep the intestinal barrier healthy, to keep leaky gut from happening, so that we're preventing immune reaction, we're preventing autoimmune disease, and then we're preventing further illness and that need for more antibiotics. Well, came today, and thank you for joining me.